The Book of Murder by Matt Murphy, former prosecutor in Orange County. Matt goes through his time prosecuting cases. This is for entertainment and art. Hope you enjoy Matt's book. I loved it. You can find the other chapters in my library. Go follow along. 12 gauge. Given any information about potential jurors beyond their names, and you can't go home and research them. So a good lawyer will learn to look at every visible detail when evaluating a potential juror. What are they wearing? How do they carry themselves? What book are they holding as they walk into the courtroom? In the end, jury selection is far more art than science. What is the energy you feel? Are they interacting with other jurors? Paying attention to the judge? Is this a person who will likely listen to you in the end? You must learn to first develop an instinct and then trust it. Not to sound too Californian here, but it is as much about a person's vibe as anything tangible. As luck would have it, the potential juror who said she believed the death penalty was the same as murder was among the first 12 jurors seated. I had her down as an automatic kick, but I liked everyone else in the box and didn't want to lose them. She was the opposite of my rich lady from Newport. Terrible on paper, but a great vibe. She said while she personally disagreed with the death penalty, she could follow the law. Some of the best judges of potential jurors are the police officers and detectives who have had to read people as if their lives depended on it, because in police work they often do. And Jose was as smart and observant as anyone I had ever worked with. If I kicked her, I would likely lose all the other jurors I really liked. If I kept her and accepted the first 12, I would have 11 jurors I really liked, and one huge question mark. Jose said he liked her. "She's with you, buddy," he said. He believed she would be open-minded and got the same vibe I did, but I didn't know whether to trust it. Here's the thing. We strategized that if we didn't kick her, the defense might believe I had overlooked her questionnaire and also accept the first 12. If they didn't, then I would excuse her and move on. But I was going to see what happened if I accepted the first 12. And take the risk that our gut instincts were right. It was a high-stakes game of chicken. I accepted the panel as constituted, and so did the defense. Wow! We impaneled our jury without exercising a single peremptory challenge. Unusual, but not unheard of. Still, I immediately started second-guessing myself. It was actually a smart move by the defense, and an advanced mental strategy on my part had just become advanced self-doubt. So be it. We had a jury. The Wozniak trial was a weeks-long slugfest. I have to admit, the defense did an excellent job for their client given what they had to work with. In the end, the evidence was simply overwhelming. In order to pay his rent and go on a super bitchin' honeymoon, Daniel Wozniak elaborately plotted the murder of 2 innocent and beloved human beings. Perhaps the most egregious part, when you think about it, is that even if Dan was going to kill Sam for his $62,000, Julie Kibuishi didn't need to die. Once the brutal murder of Sam was complete, all Wozniak had to do was send a text from Sam's cell phone that he was having some issues about anything at all and was going to take a few weeks to get his head together. Steve and Raquel would have known that something was dramatically wrong, but an adult male, posing no apparent risk to the community, would have been a very low priority for any police department. People go missing all the time who eventually turn up in Vegas on a bender, or in Cabo, or in rehab, and police simply don't have the resources or inclination to hunt everyone down who hasn't talked to their parents in a while. A disturbed combat veteran on the loose, however, who has seemingly just raped and murdered someone in his apartment, is an all-hands-on-deck, no-resource spared emergency situation. So not only was Wozniak's plan utterly horrific in every conceivable way, it was stupid. Killing just Sam would have given him weeks to drain the bank account. Killing Julie guaranteed that every cop in Orange County would be hunting for him. Along the way, Dan literally danced and sang, left a trail of irrefutable evidence, and severed a human head. The jury returned the fastest death verdict in the history of Orange County. As for Rachel Buffett, we always believed she knew far more than she revealed to police. But she didn't just hold back information, she positively lied. Big lies, little lies. Her story never added up. We believed she knew Dan was somehow involved in Julie's murder, But what she knew and when she knew it remains an open question. Without solid evidence that she knew beforehand, or that she deliberately aided in the commission of the acts in some way, we couldn't charge her with either murder. Once again, it doesn't matter how reprehensible someone may be. If you can't prove it, you can't charge it. A prosecutor, above all else, must honor the presumption of innocence. I could prove that Rachel lied after the murders, and that is what we did. She was tried as an accessory after the fact the following year, and was convicted and sentenced to 32 months in state prison. Did Dan really think he was getting away with this? The answer doesn't matter, because he didn't get away with it. He'll never see freedom again. Vegas baby Laguna Beach is a phenomenal place to live, especially if you're a surfer. With Newport Beach and Huntington Beach to the north, and San Clemente to the south, Laguna is an eclectic community nestled on the side of a small coastal mountain range overlooking the rocky coves and kelp beds of southern Orange County. The place has always fostered its own unique brand of surf culture. Timothy Leary of LSD fame moved there in the 1960s to turn on, tune in, drop out, and the Beach Boys sang about it in Surfin' Safari. Aside from the surfing, with a thriving and dynamic gay community, expensive homes, fine dining, and fancy galleries, Laguna is also renowned for its many resident artists. Having lived there for my first 4 years after law school, I may be biased, but I believe it is one of the most picturesque places on the entire West Coast. When most people think about the stereotypical California lifestyle, they forget that much of the state is composed of desert, farmland, and the often frigid climate of Northern California. But for those fortunate enough to actually live that quintessential surfer lifestyle, places like Laguna Beach are home to some of the happiest people on the planet. One of those lucky few was Chris Smith. Chris grew up in a small town near Santa Cruz, California, in a house on a lake, where he and his younger brother Paul fell in love with all things water. From a very early age, Chris was obsessed with surfing, and for a time even hoped to become a professional wakeboarder. An injury to his Achilles tendon redirected him into the business world, and he moved to the Southern California community of Temecula, not quite on the water, but not too bad of a drive, where he took a job in the advertising business. Like pretty much every young surfer at one point or another, Chris spoke openly of his dream of one day sailing off into the sunset, with a surfboard under one arm and a good-looking woman under the other. But he had a career to build first and money to earn. After a couple of years, Chris met another young man in the advertising world, Ed Shin. Ed worked for a different company, and the two often crossed paths. They instantly liked each other. Chris and Ed were both young, handsome, and ambitious. But there were differences between them. Chris was very smart, but more of an artist at heart than a businessman like Ed. An adrenaline junkie who loved fast boats, faster cars, and big waves, Chris was always looking for adventure and the promise of a life of freedom on the water. Like me, he took regular surf trips to Costa Rica, Mexico, and Indonesia, and while he loved his family, he was very close to Paul, Paul's wife Leah, and his 2 young nieces. He enjoyed the single life. Ed seemed the model of stability in comparison. He had a business degree from UC San Diego, a devoted wife, and 3 young children. Shin was active in his church and participated in bi-weekly Bible study classes. He loved taking his kids to Disneyland. He had even found his job through a businessman he met in Bible study, Joseph Gray. Gray had given Ed a chance to help him launch a new online advertising venture after Joseph had found success in a related TV ad business. Ed was eager to move on from Joseph's company, though, and before too long he and Chris decided to leave their respective jobs and start a business together. They figured they could combine their skill sets to build their own ad company and stop making money for other people. In 2009, they started 800Exchange, staking out a corner of the ad business known as lead generation. Think about the late-night commercials and online banner ads for things like debt consolidation, hair loss cures, or lowering monthly mortgage payments. The companies that design and place those ads don't necessarily work for businesses that provide those products or services. Instead, companies like 800Exchange would run ads and collect information from people who responded leads, and then sell that information to businesses they would contract with, giving them a list of people interested in their services who they could then call or email. Lead generation is a robust subset of the advertising industry, and operations like 800XChange, which have the advertising and internet expertise to get people calling and clicking, can be incredibly lucrative. In their first year in business, Ed and Chris, each barely 30 years old, grossed over $12 million. The vast majority of the money the company took in was profit. All they needed was a little bit of office space, a few employees, and, of course, the cost of the advertising. Due to the payment formula for leads and their low overhead, it was like they were printing money. From the outside, Chris's life seemed close to perfect. He had a wildly successful business he had co-founded with a friend and was making the kind of money most people can only dream of. He had a gorgeous girlfriend, Erica, a professional dancer, to whom he was getting ready to propose. He was driving a new Range Rover and had moved into a luxury ocean view apartment in Laguna. Business was going so well that he had offered his brother Paul a job, and Paul's family moved down to Laguna as well. Chris was spending most mornings on the water. He would head into the office after surfing and work late into the evenings on new ad campaigns. Ed was handling the business side, Chris was generating the creative product, and together they were absolutely killing it. But things were not as idyllic as they seemed. It turned out that Ed had moved on from his previous job, not just because he was ready to start something for himself, but because he didn't want to hang around and wait for certain things to be discovered. Joseph Gray had helped Ed significantly, even assisting him with buying a house, impressed by Ed's intelligence, his devotion to his wife and kids, and his apparent love of the Lord. I could tell that Ed was driven, and, early age, Chris was obsessed with surfing, and for a time even hoped to become a professional wakeboarder. An injury to his Achilles tendon redirected him into the business world, and he moved to the Southern California community of Temecula, not quite on the water, but not too bad of a drive, where he took a job in the advertising business. Like pretty much every young surfer at one point or another, Chris spoke openly of his dream of one day sailing off into the sunset, with a surfboard under one arm and a good-looking woman under the other. But he had a career to build first and money to earn. After a couple of years, Chris met another young man in the advertising world, Ed Shin. Ed worked for a different company, and the two often crossed paths. They instantly liked each other. Chris and Ed were both young, handsome, and ambitious. But there were differences between them. Chris was very smart, but more of an artist at heart than a businessman like Ed. An adrenaline junkie who loved fast boats, faster cars, and big waves, Chris was always looking for adventure and the promise of a life of freedom on the water. Like me, he took regular surf trips to Costa Rica, Mexico, and Indonesia, and while he loved his family, he was very close to Paul, Paul's wife Leah, and his two young nieces. He enjoyed the single life. Ed seemed the model of stability in comparison. He had a business degree from UC San Diego, a devoted wife, and 3 young children. Shin was active in his church and participated in bi-weekly Bible study classes. He loved taking his kids to Disneyland. He had even found his job through a businessman he met in Bible study, Joseph Gray. Gray had given Ed a chance to help him launch a new online advertising venture after Joseph had found success in a related TV ad business. Ed was eager to move on from Joseph's company, though, and before too long he and Chris decided to leave their respective jobs and start a business together. They figured they could combine their skill sets to build their own ad company and stop making money for other people. In 2009, they started 800XChange, staking out a corner of the ad business known as lead generation. Think about the late-night commercials and online banner ads for things like debt consolidation, hair loss cures, or lowering monthly mortgage payments. The companies that design and place those ads don't necessarily work for businesses that provide those products or services. Instead, companies like 800XChange would run ads and collect information from people who responded leads and then sell that information to businesses they would contract with, giving them a list of people interested in their services who they could then call or email. Lead generation is a robust subset of the advertising industry, and operations like 800XChange, which have the advertising and internet expertise to get people calling and clicking, can be incredibly lucrative. In their first year in business, Ed and Chris, each barely 30 years old, grossed over $12 million. The vast majority of the money the company took in was profit. All they needed was a little bit of office space, a few employees, and, of course, the cost of the advertising. Due to the payment formula for leads and their low overhead, it was like they were printing money. From the outside, Chris's life seemed close to perfect. He had a wildly successful business he had co-founded with a friend and was making the kind of money most people can only dream of. He had a gorgeous girlfriend, Erica, a professional dancer to whom he was getting ready to propose. He was driving a new Range Rover and had moved into a luxury ocean view apartment in Laguna. Business was going so well that he had offered his brother Paul a job, and Paul's family moved down to Laguna as well. Chris was spending most mornings on the water. He would head into the office after surfing and work late into the evenings on new ad campaigns. Ed was handling the business side, Chris was generating the creative product, and together they were absolutely killing it. But things were not as idyllic as they seemed. It turned out that Ed had moved on from his previous job, not just because he was ready to start something for himself, but because he didn't want to hang around and wait for certain things to be discovered. Joseph Gray had helped Ed significantly, even assisting him with buying a house, impressed by Ed's intelligence, his devotion to his wife and kids, and his apparent love of the Lord. I could tell that Ed was driven and escape, maybe be a bartender on an island somewhere, enjoying the sun and the surf instead of the frustrations of the corporate world. Like so many surfers, Chris dreamed of hanging it up, turning his back on the rat race, and living a simple life on the ocean. Chris had invested a fair bit of his wealth in South African gold coins called Krugerrands and therefore had some immediate liquidity. His dream of leaving it all behind was familiar to all who knew him. Based on emails to his family over the following week, it appeared that Chris had decided to really do it, but it wasn't exactly the escape they had imagined. Chris's girlfriend, Erica, recalled that his family believed he was getting ready to propose, received a text from Chris's phone saying he was in Las Vegas, and then, via a cold, heartless email, he broke up with her, harshly. He told her he didn't love her, and that he was running off to the Galapagos with a former Playboy playmate named Tiffany Taylor. Paul couldn't believe Chris would do such a thing and asked him to send a photo just to let him know he was okay. Paul soon received an email containing a photo of a stunning Tiffany Taylor getting out of a swimming pool, but no Chris. The photo irked Paul. He wanted a picture of the two of them, and this seemed to be more of a modeling shot than something Chris would have taken himself. More troubling, Paul and the rest of Chris's family couldn't believe that he would dump Erica like that and run away with no notice, no warning, and no goodbyes. It bugged Paul that Chris would sell his share of the company, a company he'd brought Paul in to work for, and not even tell him, he found out from Ed. Not to mention, Chris was supposed to pick Paul and his family up from the airport. They were returning from a vacation, and he never showed. He was already gone. His family was torn between anger, concern, and acceptance that sometimes this was just the way Chris was. He had been known to disappear before. He had checked out more than once for a few days to grab some waves and clear his head. Although Paul, Erica, and Chris's parents were all disappointed by Chris's sudden departure, they had to admit to themselves that it wasn't as shocking as it might have been if he didn't have this history, and the expressed desire to one day get away from it all. Confusing emails continued from Chris to his family for several months. His vacation grew longer and longer. From the Galapagos, he went to Peru and then Argentina, and eventually crossed the ocean to Africa. His mood in the emails seemed to fluctuate. At one point, he emailed his parents that it had been a really rough year and that he'd thought about doing the unspeakable. He said he'd been reflecting on what he now thought had been a troubled childhood, and that someday in the future, he'd share his thoughts with them. The problem was that he didn't have a troubled childhood. In fact, with two loving parents, a brother for a best friend, and the ocean for his backyard, it was pretty close to ideal. This kind of talk didn't sound like Chris and alarmed his family, who had never known him to have any kind of emotional drama while growing up. His father, Steve, was a firefighter, his mother, Debbie, was a preschool teacher, and he grew up in a supportive, all-American family. this wasn't the Chris they knew. As time went by, Steve, who had been a cop before switching to the fire department, began to develop a bad feeling about the whole situation. He sent an email asking Chris to confirm the name of the lake that he had grown up on and the kind of boat they used to drive. Chris wrote back, "Kelly Lake," and told his father to stop worrying so much. Steve tried to relax and convince himself everything was okay. But the months kept on passing with barely any communication. Finally, as the end of the year approached, 6 months since Chris had left on his trip, it seemed like he was beginning to make new plans. Chris emailed Paul that they should meet in March in Costa Rica, and that he would share his ideas for a new business. But the emails also described a trip that was getting more and more dangerous. Chris said he met a man in India who was sailing to North Africa, and that Chris was going to hitch a ride. He mentioned something about trying to sell some of his Krugerrands, going somewhere in Rwanda, where he'd apparently heard about someone paying a 30% markup, which made no sense in its own right. Finally, he said he planned to go to the Congo and buy a conflict diamond. A young white man, loaded with gold coins, heading solo into one of the most dangerous areas of the world. This adventure was giving his mother fits. It sounded extremely dangerous, and the note about the trip further into Africa ended up being the last email the family ever received. Steve and Debbie were now starting to fear the worst. Weeks went by with no word at all. Debbie was looking at every news report she could find about young Americans being kidnapped or murdered in Africa, even trying to find the village where Chris might have traveled and zooming in on Google Street View to see if she could happen to catch just a glimpse of her son. And Steve was trying to figure out where exactly his son had ended up. Desperate, he called the U.S. State Department to find out the last place where Chris's passport had been used. This is where things began to fall apart. Chris's passport hadn't been used at all. As far as the government was concerned, he was still in the U.S. This was not good. Concerning on a different front, Paul was still working at 800 Exchange, and Ed had taken the entire company to Las Vegas in order to host a party to impress potential new clients. There, he had engaged a Vegas host who hired a bunch of atmosphere models, quote, professionally gorgeous women to join the festivities to give the impression that the company was the coolest thing around. Surrounded by all the lights and bling and all things Vegas, Paul looked across the room and was suddenly shocked. Looking stunning in a black cocktail dress, there was Tiffany Taylor, the former playmate who had supposedly been on the trip with Chris. Chris's emails had stopped mentioning Tiffany a while back, and it had seemed like Chris might be on his own now, but he thought she would certainly have some answers. Paul beelined to her. "Aren't you supposed to be traveling with my brother?" Paul wanted to know all about their trip and how his brother was doing. She looked up and appeared confused. "I'm sorry, but I have no idea what you are talking about," she said. "I have never been to the Galapagos, and I'm afraid I don't know your brother." Paul looked over at Ed, who shook his head and tried to tell Paul that Chris had been with a different Tiffany Taylor. The picture had definitely been of this woman. Things were no longer making any sense at all. Steve drove down from his home in Oregon to Laguna Beach to meet with Ed. He wanted answers, but Ed didn't have much to tell him. He insisted he didn't know any more than the family did, and that Chris was halfway around the world. Had Ed made payments to Chris, as their deal had specified? Ed insisted that Chris wanted him to wire the money to an account in the Cayman Islands. Steve asked about the passport, and Ed told him that he'd actually been with Chris when he got a fake passport in Vegas, wanting to be untraceable in his travels. Ed gave Steve the name of his Vegas host/fixer, a man named John Caponin, known as Johnny Vegas, saying he had arranged for the fake passport. Steve did not know what to make of any of this, and he reported Chris missing to the Laguna Beach Police Department. At first, they resisted taking the case, saying he needed to file back home in Oregon, but Steve pushed, and eventually, they agreed. Detectives from Laguna Beach arranged for an interview with Ed at the police department. Ed had paid off his restitution and was out of trouble with the law, or so it seemed. He was cooperative, relaxed, and charming with the detectives. Ed methodically laid out the same story he had given Steve. Chris had signed away his share of the company, gotten a fake passport, and decided to travel the world. Ed said he would be happy to produce proof of the wire transfers and copies of the emails he'd received. He complained that running the business had been hard without his partner, and that it had been a very stressful 6 months. About halfway through the interview, it appeared that the detectives relaxed, persuaded by Ed that Chris was probably sitting on a beach somewhere. It occurred to me when I reviewed the interview tape that the detectives very likely believed his story. There was no obvious reason for them not to. Shin was incredibly smooth. But Ed Shin had made a mistake, one of a few mistakes, as it would turn out. Ed had moved the company to a different office location several months earlier and had skipped out on the rent at the old building. Why he didn't think it would ever be pursued still isn't clear to me. Ed was a smart guy, with a lot to lose, and this was an unforced error. The property manager did eventually come looking for him and knocked on the door of local private detective Joe Dalu, who had recently moved into the same office complex. The property manager said he wanted to find Ed and Chris in order to get the back rent, and Joe didn't have much trouble finding Ed. Chris was another story. Joe reached out to Chris's father and heard the long saga of Chris's vacation and then disappearance. He was intrigued and volunteered, pro bono, for free, to help out and look into it a little further. Joe was savvy and thorough, a solid investigator, and the Smiths were lucky he had landed in their lap. Joe reviewed the emails and noticed the email trap that Steve had attempted to set. He saw that Chris had told his father the name of the lake he grew up on, but never the type of boat. At the same time, as it turned out, Chris had emailed his brother Paul and asked, out of the blue, "What kind of boat did we have growing up?" He was fishing for the information their father had asked for. Suspicious for sure. It turned out that the old 800 exchange offices were still vacant, having been completely abandoned by Shin, at this point a full 10 months earlier. Joe asked the property manager if he could have a look around. Of course, why not? Shin was certainly in no position to object, and here is where things went from suspicious to sinister. Before even entering the office, Joe looked through the glass front door and immediately noticed a stain on a light switch that appeared to be dark red. Based on his training and experience as a former police officer, he suspected it might be blood. Joe backed out carefully, recognizing the scene would need to be forensically processed. Just as Joe Dalu was calling investigators to take a look at the old 800 exchange offices, I was conducting a training session for new detectives at the Sheriff's Academy and was approached by Detective Julia Bowman from Laguna Beach. She was young and energetic and wanted to discuss the Shin case. She didn't agree with her supervisor's apparent assessment that Shin was telling the truth, and she wanted to talk. Laguna Beach, where Chris had lived, was my jurisdiction. The 800 Exchange Company was headquartered in nearby San Juan Capistrano, so it was patrolled by the Sheriff's Department, and therefore in the territory of my colleague Brahim Beitia. Brahim had already fielded some phone calls regarding the case from Orange County Sheriff's Office investigators, Sergeants Don Vaught and Ray Wirt. We decided that since it was a Laguna Beach missing person, I would take the case, but Don and Ray would conduct the investigation. They were real pros. As soon as it became clear there was more to the story, they began interviewing witnesses to put together a picture of what had happened in the days leading up to Chris's disappearance the previous June. They compiled warrants to examine business records, financial statements, phone records, and even the furniture that had been used in Chris's office. They also, of course, wanted the Orange County Crime Lab to come in and forensically process the abandoned offices. They sprayed luminol, a chemical that reacts with the proteins in blood, turning old stains into an ironically dazzling fluorescent blue. When they got to Chris's old office, blood appeared to be everywhere. It had now been almost a year since Chris had last been seen, but evidence doesn't always vanish with time. They found additional specks of blood in areas that might be missed if someone tried to clean a crime scene, behind a door jamb, behind the baseboards, and even on the ceiling. Then they pulled up the carpeting. One of the most common mistakes among people who attempt to cover up a crime scene is not realizing that liquids will sink through a carpet right down to the padding at the bottom. You can clean the top layer of carpet perfectly well, but As anyone who has ever attempted to housebreak a pet knows, if you get a carpet dirty enough, it will eventually have to be replaced no matter how thoroughly you clean the surface. When the crime lab lifted the carpeting in Chris's former office, any hope of him still being alive immediately vanished. Large stains of a coagulated red substance were immediately recognized by the experienced forensics team. They knew it was blood before they even applied the luminol. The entire scene was a bloody mess. Using DNA samples from Chris's parents and Paul, they were able to determine all of the blood was from one source, and that source was Chris Smith. Sergeants Vogt and Wirt began interviewing people who worked for the company. Their media buyer said that Ed had closed the office for the week after he supposedly bought Chris out of his partnership. Ed explained to several employees that Chris had become drunk after they closed the deal, vomiting red wine all over the interior of his office, and that it needed to be cleaned before they could return to work. She recalled returning a week later and noticing a horrible smell emanating from the office. Thinking back, the property manager also remembered a call from Ed around that time, asking about cleaning. He told him he had cut his hand and wanted to know how to get blood out of the carpet. No employees remembered Ed having any injuries at all when they returned from the week at home. And, of course, the blood the investigators found all belonged to Chris. As additional records trickled in pursuant to various warrants, it became starkly apparent that the financial gain component of this case was significant. The Business 800 exchange was hugely profitable. Ed Shin should have had the money to pay back Joseph Gray and avoid prison. But he didn't. Why not? As investigators dug deeper into Shin's life, all roads kept leading back to the same place: Las Vegas and the Wynn Hotel. Chris had sent an email to his attorney about Ed renting a safe and storing almost $200,000 of gold coins without his permission at the Wynn. Paul talked about meeting Atmosphere model Tiffany Taylor at the Wynn. Business junkets before and after Chris's disappearance were all at the Wynn. Jennifer Matthews remembered Ed gambling feverishly on one of her business trips to Vegas at the Wynn. It appeared that Mr. Bible Study was spending substantial time somewhere other than Disneyland with his kids. More clues emerged when investigators went to Chris's apartment in Laguna Beach and found that a man named Kenny Kraft was now living there. They discovered he was also driving Chris's Range Rover, which, when forensically processed, was found to have more of Chris's blood in a crevice of the rear cargo compartment, and even wearing his clothes. Kraft had been hired by Ed after Chris's disappearance as a personal assistant. Kraft, though somewhat reluctantly, cooperated completely with investigators. He said that Shin had given him permission to move into Chris's apartment and drive his car, both of which were actually being paid for by the company. He said that all of Chris's stuff was still in the apartment when he moved in, including Chris's 2 favorite surfboards, a dispositive clue to any real surfer. If you're going on a surf trip, you definitely don't leave your boards behind. Ed told Kenny he could drive the car, wear the clothes, and sell the boards. Kraft said he had also gone to Vegas with Shin and that they traveled in style. Not only had they flown by private jet, but in fact, they had been picked up by the Wynn Hotel's very own private jet. Unbeknownst to the Wynn, Ed had filled the plane with booze and exotic dancers providing lap dances on the way out. Mr. Kraft didn't mention anything about Bible study on the plane. As everyone knows, Las Vegas operates in a reality that has to be unique in all the world. An oasis of lights and false opportunity in the middle of one of the world's hottest and most desolate deserts, it's not a bad place to visit if you like to play golf or sit by the pool for a couple of days. But those fabulous buildings weren't built on the winning nights of amateur gamblers. The blinging sounds and cool air of those casinos supplement the complimentary cocktails that make it a little easier to buy just one more stack of chips and see what happens. Lurking under the thin veneer of fine dining, pretty lights, and just one more roll success is a seedy underbelly that exists to fulfill the other name for Las Vegas, Sin City. This is the world of party hosts, pimps, and cocaine dealers. This is where a guy like Ed Shin can show up with embezzled money on a casino jet, get comped a fantasy room, gamble his guts out, and then get virtually anything else he wants from the legion of people not employed by the hotel, who are all there to service his desires, for a negotiated price, of course. Even though 800 Exchange was a hugely profitable business, Ed Shin didn't have the money to pay Joseph Gray, because in reality, he was a degenerate gambler. Ed Shin lost literally millions of dollars at the tables of the Wynn Casino in Las Vegas, on trips that continued even after Chris's murder. One employee said that when he went to bed, he saw Shin at the tables with stacks of "purple chips." A purple chip at the Wynn is worth $500, and in Vegas a stack is usually 20 chips. He said when he got up the next morning, Ed was still gambling away at the same table. Ed's fancy parties with the Atmosphere models were held on trips that were being comped by the Wynn, arguably the nicest hotel in Vegas, with a 2-story suite equipped with a private elevator, a pool table, and even 24-hour butler service. The casinos fawned over Ed not because he was a great guy, but because he was one of the biggest losers they knew. Like Michael Corleone's brother Fredo famously banging cocktail waitresses 2 at a time, Ed Shin, according to Kenny Kraft, regularly engaged the services of multiple sex workers in Las Vegas, sometimes at the same time. Kraft, who wasn't hired until after Chris was gone, claimed to have gone to Vegas with Shin no fewer than a dozen times. Family man, indeed. The search warrant came back on Shin's phone records, and a new dimension in the investigation began to take shape. Ed Shin had rented a pickup truck at a U-Haul in San Clemente, and his cell phone had pinged near a transponder tower in the middle of the desert, just north of the Mexican border in East San Diego County. It was 3 in the morning. The records show his phone traveling from Orange County just 2 days after Chris went missing. Once detectives saw the phone evidence, they realized there was little chance they would ever find Chris's body, at least not without Ed's help. There is a moment in the beginning of the movie Casino when Joe Pesci's character, based on the real-life Vegas mobster Anthony "the Ant" Spilotro, informs the viewer about the intricacies of properly burying a body in the desert. A lot of holes in the desert, and a lot of problems are buried in those holes. But you gotta do it right. Delivered in a way that only Joe Pesci could make both chilling and funny, the comment is in fact based on real life. Over the last 120 years, there have been 141 bodies recovered in Riverside County alone that have defied identification. And those are only the bodies that have been found. Early in my time in homicide, Larry Montgomery and I worked a case where a woman named Judy Velo had murdered her boyfriend after incorrectly accusing him of cheating, and taken the body to Blythe, California near the Arizona border. We knew she went off into the desert on an ATV early in the morning with a small attached trailer and returned several hours later. When Larry informed one of the local sheriffs that he was thinking about bringing a cadaver dog out to look for the body, the sheriff laughed. "Oh, you can bring your dog," he said, "and I can almost guarantee you will find a body, but it won't be the one you're looking for." Larry was taken aback. "You guys find that many bodies?" he asked. The sheriff answered with a chuckle. "Son, on Judgment Day, when the dead all rise, it's going to be standing room only out here." Unless Shin confessed, there was almost no chance we would find Chris. If I filed charges, it was pretty clear this was going to have to be prosecuted as another nobody case. Many people assume the most difficult cases to prosecute are those where the victim has never been found. How, after all, do you really prove someone is dead when there is no dead body? Counterintuitively, such cases are actually easier in many ways. As a prosecutor in a homicide case, you need to prove that a human being was killed. The existence of a body satisfies that element most clearly, but without a body you must first prove that death. You get to present evidence that might not otherwise be allowed about who the victim was as a human being, or in the immortal words of Lou Rosenblum, the jury sees the soul of your victim reflected in the eyes of those who loved them. You get to call the person's best friend to say the victim never would have missed the big game, their grandma to say the victim never would have skipped Thanksgiving dinner, or their girlfriend to say he never would have left without his beloved dog. It is legally necessary but also incredibly powerful testimony. The jury sees the visceral pain of the victim's loved ones and what it's like for the family to never have a place to mourn. They end up understanding the emotional desire to believe emails that seem so obviously bogus with the benefit of hindsight. It has a profound impact. That's not to say you don't still have to do the work, and that's not to say you don't still need evidence. But it certainly appeared that Edward Shin was guilty as hell, whether we found Chris Smith's body or not. Police were getting ready to reapproach Ed with all of this new evidence when they got an alert that he was about to take off on a flight to Canada. They immediately called me, and it was decision time. With no body, did we have enough to charge him? Ray Wirt reached out to Shin's probation officer to find out if he had travel restrictions and if he needed permission to leave the country. The answers were yes and yes. Getting on a flight to Canada was a violation of Shin's probation on the embezzlement case. So without tipping Ed off that they were really there to ask about Chris, detectives had him pulled off the plane just before takeoff. They were very polite and asked him no questions, but on the ride back to the sheriff's department, Ed started talking. Flim-flammers, snake oil salespeople, and con artists typically can't help themselves. Once in the interview room, and after Shin had been properly Mirandized, Don Vogt and Ray Wirt led him to the real topic. They asked if he'd been in contact with the police since his embezzlement case, and he didn't volunteer that Laguna Beach detectives had talked to him about Chris's disappearance. When they brought up Chris, he told the very same story that had worked at Laguna Beach. Chris was a free spirit, a surfer, and had taken a round-the-world trip before his emails suddenly stopped. After hours getting nowhere, Wirt and Vaught decided to confront Ed with the blood evidence. They told him that Chris's blood was found on the walls, in the door jamb of his office, and on the ceiling. They asked him how it got there. Ed resisted. He said he had no idea what they were talking about. He asked for a lawyer, and the investigators immediately stopped the interview. Just minutes later, no lawyer yet, Ed said he wanted them to come back in so he could set the record straight. He wanted assurance that if he told a sensible story, perhaps he wouldn't be charged with murder. Of course they couldn't promise that, but they told him they wanted to know what happened. Suddenly, Ed's story completely changed. He described an epic brawl in the office, where Chris, drunk and on sleeping pills, stressed over the embezzlement, and worried Ed was going to implicate him in the scheme, attacked Ed viciously. Ed talked about how they both ended up in midair, Chris on his desk, launching himself toward Ed like two fighting rams. Eventually, after much back and forth, Chris chased Ed into the hall, and then Ed, summoning new strength within him, threw Chris back into his office, and Chris's head hit the side of his desk. Suddenly, he was unconscious and there was blood all over. Ed didn't know what to do. He said he didn't believe that police would trust him, given the embezzlement charge, and so he didn't call 911. Instead, he said he drove around, confused and in a state of shock, and then came back, hoping Chris would still be alive. But the pool of blood was larger than before, and Chris wasn't moving. So he called someone who connected Ed to a guy who could clean everything up, the body and the office. Ed met this mystery man at a gas station, a young, strong, blonde man with a flat-top style haircut and a Russian accent, and gave him $10,000 or $15,000. Ed claimed he never heard from him again. It wasn't murder, Ed said. It was self-defense, and he had no idea where the body was. The emails, Ed admitted, were all invented by him to keep Chris's girlfriend and family from finding out the truth. Yes, he could have been kinder to Erica, he knew, and perhaps it was a bad call to try and blame Chris's parents for what seemed to be leading toward suicide at one point in the email chain. Ed said it got too hard pretending to be Chris, and so he stopped, though clearly he'd hoped the family would have concluded he'd died somewhere on that trip to sell his gold coins in Africa. There was no body, no weapon, and with a good enough story, Shin figured he could talk his way out of it. It was pretty obvious while watching the recorded interview that this was exactly what Shin was still doing. The question was, would it work? And although he did a reasonable job of inventing a story that explained a small portion of the forensics, there were a few critical problems. The first was Ed's puzzling lack of injuries. Not a drop of blood in that office belonged to Ed, and no one ever saw him with even a scratch on him. He told investigators at one point that he had trained himself not to bleed. Listening to the interview, I needed to rewind that part. Did he really just say that? The second problem was the email to Chris's lawyer at 6:01 that evening. The last employee left the office that day at 5 p.m., so it was impossible for whatever happened that day to have started any sooner. Given that, it seems extraordinary that despite being overcome with shock and grief and, quote, driving around, as he claimed, the first thing Ed decided to do was draft a typo-free email to Chris's attorney saying that Chris was agreeing to sell his share of the company. The clear-headedness of that email, the coherent thoughts that would have been necessary to come up with that plan, did not track with anything Ed said about his state of mind. Not to mention, when would he have had time to write it? It seemed beyond clear to me that the email must have been prepared in advance. Ed did not go into Chris's office and get blindsided by an attack from a man with no history of violent behavior. This had to have been planned, and worse, the motive was clearly financial. As soon as Chris was dead, Ed was ready to press send. Putting aside the murder of children, some of the most morally depraved cases involve killing for money. The killer or killers will often cook up elaborate plans that you as a prosecutor, along with your investigators, have to undo. They typically involve false leads and some sort of fake evidence to throw detectives off the scent. Here, of course, we had a whole book of fake emails. It was shocking to hear Ed reveal that he had spent literally months posing as the business partner he'd killed in cold blood, spinning tale after tale to his petrified family. Perhaps the biggest problem with Shin's story came in the form of the smallest forensic evidence, those tiny, almost imperceptible blood specks all over the metal partition strips between the ceiling tiles. There is an entire discipline in the world of forensic science devoted completely to what is known as blood spatter evidence. It is essentially a detailed analysis of how blood is dispersed at a crime scene. Like the arterial spurting on the inside trunk lid of Kathy Torres's red car, the findings can be hugely significant. In Shin's case, blood on the ceiling was consistent with what is known as cast-off, and pretty much only happens with repeated stab wounds or blows from a blunt object. Those tiny droplets of blood were far more consistent with Shin beating Chris to death with a baseball bat than him hitting his head on the corner of a desk. Thank you for listening to The Book of Murder by Matt Murphy. I am 12 Gauge, and thank you for visiting 12 Gauge Investigative. Be aware and watch your 6.